Um, Last week I talked about the impacts, the economic impacts of climate change. I'm going to expand on that in 2 or 3 dimensions, depending on how fast I go. So we looked at this graph. It suggested that the initial impacts of climate change may be positive. But then as we move to more profound climate change, we see more and more negative impacts. This is all evaluated at the global average, which is not very helpful because very few people live at a global average. So you may rightly wonder if the average impact is, say, 1%, or welfare loss that is equivalent to losing 1% of your income at the global mean, what does that imply for people around the world? It's a very similar sort of exercise. Previously, I put together those estimates, almost 30 of the global impact on welfare, and then for the 2.5 degree, there were about 11 estimates. Here I put all the estimates together for 2.5 degrees of warming, but now by country. And obviously there's a bit of imputation going on, scaling up from regions, or scaling down from regions to countries. So the blue dots are the best estimates. And then the bars that you see are an indication of the spread in between the studies about this impact. The overall pattern that you're looking at, so this is again the welfare equivalent income loss. Now for all the countries in the world, and the countries are ordered as to their per capita income in the year 2005. And you see a very distinct pattern there. That is that richer countries are much less vulnerable to the impacts of climate change than our poorer countries. And note that the income axis is logarithmic. There's obvious exceptions there, but by and large, poor means high impacts. There's 3 basic reasons for this. The first is simple exposure. Poor economies tend to have a large share of their activities in sectors that are directly exposed to the weather and therefore to the climate. Think agriculture. Rich countries like the UK make their money mostly through banking and those sort of sectors. And it means that you're vulnerable to all sorts of things, but not to the weather. Whereas if most of your income comes from agriculture, then you're obviously exposed to climate much more than if most of your income comes from banking. Second reason is that hotter countries tend, or richer, poorer. Second reason is that poorer countries tend to be hotter. If time permits, I'll come back to that at the end. And hotter countries tend to suffer greater impacts as well. And that is shown in this graph. So this is the temperature at the moment, or rather the average temperature over the last 30 years in these countries, and this is again the estimates of the impact, and you see a very clear trend there that hotter countries tend to be more vulnerable to climate change than colder countries. The reasons for that is twofold. One is biophysical. A lot of systems are closer to their limits, and some of it is behavioral. So during evolution, plants, animals, whatever has been exposed to a certain range of temperatures, that is within the bounds of history. Colder places simply need to go somewhat into the revolutionary past or somewhere closer to the equator to find out what behavior, what genes and so on and so forth you would need to adapt to this, whereas in the hotter places that simply is not available. And similarly on the behavioral side, if you wonder what life would be like in Brighton, if it's a few degrees warmer, then you could look at Marseille, then you could look at Barcelona, and how do people behave there, right? Should we introduce siestas in Brighton as they do in southern Spain in order to cope with the hotter weather? Should we adapt our buildings, which at the moment are very much focused or very much designed to keep the heat in? Whereas if you look at southern Spain, buildings are very much designed to keep the heat out. And maybe we should adopt Spanish building designs in the UK. So it's pretty obvious how we would adapt to a warmer climate. It's pretty obvious that there's people living in warmer climates who are about as happy and about as rich as we are. But if you live in the hottest place on Earth, then there is no analog. There's no place where you can look, if it gets warmer still, what should I do with my buildings? What should I do with my behavior? What should I do with my technology? What should I do with my infrastructure? That doesn't mean that it's impossible to adapt, but you would have to invent everything from scratch. And that is simply more costly and more involved than adopting other people's technological and behavioral standards. So that is the second reason why richer countries are less vulnerable to climate change. The third has to do with limited adaptive capacity. And it is simply the case that poorer countries have a lower adaptive capacity than richer countries. So adaptive capacity is just a fancy word. It essentially means your ability to adapt. It's a bit of jargon. And that depends on a range of things, all of which are closely correlated with development. So let's take the example of coastal protection. So sea levels rise, you want to do something about it rather than let your land be submerged by the sea. So first question is, would you actually know how to cope with this? Do you know how to build a dike? Do you know how to build a levee? Do you know how to build a groin? So that is the first question. And obviously, if you have a wider range of technologies at your disposal, you'll be better able to adapt. And typically, richer countries have access to more technologies than poorer countries do. The second question, about as obvious, is that you need to have the resources to pay for this. It doesn't help if you know how to build a dike, but you cannot afford to build a dike. And obviously, by definition, richer countries have greater resources than poorer countries. And then there is a range of softer issues around adaptive capacity that also make it greater in richer countries. I mean, it's not just that you need to know how to build a dike and be able to pay for it, but you should also somehow be able to mobilize society to do this. And that depends on such things as human capital, social capital, and so on and so forth, the structure of policy. And what you often see in definitely very poor countries is that they know the problem and in principle they can do something about it, but somehow they cannot deliver because society is so disorganized that they just can't. And sometimes they just don't want to, or the powers that be just don't want to. And a good example there is Bangladesh. So Bangladesh is very vulnerable to sea level rise. I think about 25–30% of the country is below 1 meter. Very flat. You have typhoons and everything sweeping in occasionally. So sea level rise would do a lot of damage. Do the people in Bangladesh know about dike building? Yes, they do. They are well aware of this technology. Do they have the resources at their disposal to actually pay for these things? Probably yes. If you compare Bangladesh now to the Netherlands, it's a very similar geological situation, geographical situation. So flat country, delta, densely populated, very close to the sea and very close to the river. If you compare the income of Bangladesh today to the Netherlands in 1850, then the Netherlands wasn't a whole lot richer than Bangladesh is now at that time, and obviously technology has improved quite a lot over the last 150 years. Why do I pick the year 1850 for the Netherlands? Because that is the year that the Netherlands started with its major dike building program. Before that, the Netherlands was, like Bangladesh is now, regularly plagued by very severe floods. Bangladesh knows how to do it, but why doesn't it build dikes to protect against current floods, let alone future floods? The reason is very much in the politics of Bangladesh. Bangladesh is regularly listed as one of the most corrupt countries in the world. Its government is regularly listed as amongst the most incompetent in the world. If you look at how politics works in Bangladesh, then politicians have two priorities. One is to get rich, and second is to get even with the political opponents, and that seems to occupy 95% of their time. So rather than governing the country for the good of the people that they are supposed to represent, they're mostly interested in going after their political opponents and enriching themselves and their families and their allies. Now, if you look at where the people are in Bangladesh, who lives on the floodplains, it's typically very poor people. And the political elite in Dhaka doesn't really care about these people. They're typically poorly educated, so they think that floods are the wrath of Allah, something that they did wrong in the past, and now it's just something that Allah is getting back at them. They don't associate this with incompetent politicians. And the political elite can bribe these people to pay to vote for them anyway. So there is no real political rationale, no political reason to protect these people against floods. As long as that is the case, and that goes to the human capital, social capital, decision-making part of adaptive capacity. As long as that is the case, Bangladesh will be very vulnerable to sea level rise. Going back to 1850 in the Netherlands, what happened in 1850? Well, as I said, it was the start of the dike building program. That followed from the constitutional reform of 1849, which was a response to the European Spring of 1848. And essentially what happened in 1849 was that sort of in the Netherlands was that a distant government that did not really care for the people was replaced with one that was broadly representative and a strong central government. And as soon as the politics in the Netherlands changed, the central government started with protecting its people. So there is a lot of politics and social stuff involved in adaptive capacity. And all these things are simply strongly associated with development, right? Some people say that this is a symptom of underdevelopment, other people say that it's a cause of underdevelopment, but it's pretty obvious that it's strongly associated with underdevelopment. And that makes that poor people are more vulnerable and will suffer greater consequences of climate change. Now, if this is true, then this also has implications for climate policy. So I've just argued that vulnerability to climate change is a function of development, which immediately implies that vulnerability is not constant. Vulnerability will change over time. In all our scenarios, we assume, and that is the driver of climate change, we assume that the future world will be much richer than today's world. And if that correlation that I just showed you holds and is in fact causal, then you would expect future vulnerability to be much less than current vulnerability. And a good illustration of that, I think, can be found in malaria. So what you're looking at here is a map of the change in exposure to malaria because of climate change. Malaria is related to climate in two ways. One, the parasite develops faster if it's hotter. So it grows faster, but it also means that the incubation time actually becomes shorter. So whereas in temperate circumstances, it takes about 4 weeks for the parasite to become, from its initial stage to become infectious or complete its life cycle. If it gets warmer, that actually goes down to 3 weeks. That means that one infected person can infect other people more quickly. Right? The second climate link with malaria is that mosquitoes also grow fast, become more active if it's warmer, and mosquitoes need warm, still standing water to breed, because that's where they put their eggs. Fast flowing water is no good for them, cold water is no good for them. You need warm, still standing water. So, if the world gets warmer, you would expect more malaria. If the world gets wetter, you would expect more malaria. And that is shown on this map. Uh, in yellow, you're looking at smallest increases up to 50% of the prevalence of malaria. The red, you're looking at 50% or more, up to a doubling. In purple, you're looking at those areas where malaria is not there at the moment, but could be there at least episodically in the future. And then in green, we're looking at those areas where malaria would decrease. And you actually need to look hard to find green. It's a little bit here, it's a little bit here, it's a little bit here. Mostly associated with drying, it's a little bit here as well. But by and large, you would see that a warmer and better world would be a more malarious world. This is a map of the current distribution of malaria. There's 5 colors on this map. In red, we're looking at those areas where there is malaria. In yellow, we're looking at those areas where there could be malaria, but there isn't. And in green, in blue, and in white, we're looking at those areas where there cannot be malaria, and therefore there isn't. So the two relevant colors are red and yellow. And the difference between the red and the yellow is development, right? Malaria used to be endemic in southern England. George Washington did not want Washington, D.C. to be built in the swamps of the Potomac because of the risk of malaria. Until 1946, malaria was rampant in Sardinia, right? But it's no longer there. The most northerly outbreak was actually in Murmansk. Stockholm also had regular outbreaks of malaria. The reason that there is no longer malaria in the rich parts of the world, the yellow bits, is threefold. One of the reasons is malaria medicine. So the life cycle of malaria is that the parasite has to be in the mosquito for a bit, then has to get into a human for a bit, and then has to go back to the mosquito, and that's what it needs to survive. If the human gets treated with malaria medicine, that doesn't just take away the symptoms of malaria, but it also takes away the infectiousness of malaria. So if you attract malaria, you get properly treated with the right medicine, and it's not just that you yourself get better, but also you no longer infect other people. So if there's a lot of malaria medicine around, you create herd immunity. So that is one reason, it's actually the smallest reason. Second reason is that we went after the mosquitoes in two ways. One is through clouds of DDT, and that was essentially the eradication of malaria in southern Italy. It had a lot to do with mass spraying of clouds of pesticides that kill a lot of mosquitoes. And the third reason, as I said, mosquitoes need warm, still standing water to breed. So if you drain your wetlands, you turn them into agricultural lands, or if you pave your roads properly, or put proper roofs on your houses, then you also take away all the small puddles of water that are around. And then the mosquitoes know where to breed, and that means that it can't transmit malaria. So that explains the difference between the red and the yellow. So it's not just that this is an association between wealth and malaria, but it's good reasons to assume that it's causal. Now, if we put all these things together, a picture like this emerges. Here we're looking at time. Here we're looking at the number of climate change-induced malaria deaths. And there's a whole bunch of lines on this graph that is just to confuse you. In blue, we're looking at the number of malaria cases as a function of climate change only. That's at the moment it's about 70,000, 75 perhaps, and it goes up to almost 300,000 cases of malaria per year by the end of the century. And then these dotted blue lines are an indication of the uncertainty about the malaria model only. And this is just a warmer and the world would be more malarious. Because we've seen a bit of climate change in the past, you would expect that the number of cases of malaria, or a certain fraction of the cases of malaria today, are caused by past climate change. Now you may think this is a basis for validating this model. That would be a big mistake. Malaria is concentrated in the tropics. A lot of people who die in the tropics don't have proper death certificates filled out. So the current, or the estimates of the current number of malaria deaths are not based on hard data, but they're actually based on a lot of statistical modeling, and not always of the greatest quality. So at the moment we think that about 500,000 people die of malaria each year, and we think that about 75,000 of those 500,000 are because of climate change, but nobody has a death certificate filled out with climate change induced malaria. So this is guesswork and statistical extrapolation rather than hard data. So that is the blue scenario. Climate is the only thing that changes. Then in the green scenario, population grows, and we find that by the end of the century, 750,000 people would die every year because of climate change induced malaria. That's a large number, right? 750,000. It's still small compared to the number of air pollution related deaths in China and India at the moment, which is counted in the millions rather than in the hundreds of thousands. By the end of the century, 750,000, which is something to worry about, right? It's a big number. And this is the sort of number that you see bandied around in the media. Now, this green scenario assumes that two things are changing. Climate is changing and population is growing. But it does not take into account that in order to drive this climate change, we need a good bit of economic growth. And we know that richer people don't die of no malaria. So if we impose that on the scenario as well, we end up in the red curve, where around the year, if this scenario is correct, the parameters are correct, around the year 2085, climate change or malaria is banished from the last parts of Africa because they're rich enough. The data suggests that people with an income above some $3,000 per person per year would not suffer that much from malaria, would probably not die from it. At this point, according to this scenario, the entire world is above that threshold. Now, this assumes the correlation that we would see across the world. We know that communist countries tend to spend much greater amounts on public health care than do other countries. So if we impose the communist pattern of the relationship between public health and income, we end up with this scenario, and malaria would be banished much, much sooner. On the other hand, you may argue that malaria is concentrated in Africa, and if we impose the African relationship between wealth and public health spending, you end up in the purple scenario, right? So there is actually a lot of uncertainty about all these things. And there's an additional complication. So here only climate is changing, here climate is changing and population is growing. Then in the red, the light brown and the purple, income is changing as well. But we don't really know really what parameters to impose there. In the brown scenario, medical technology is changing as well. And the assumption here is as follows. So you know about Bill Gates, a very rich man, decided to give away a lot of his money on good causes, and one of the things that he has promised is to develop a malaria vaccine, or rather to pay for the development of a malaria vaccine. And they've set, the Gates Foundation has set the goal for delivering this by the year 2020. And the assumption in this scenario is that unlike the Microsoft operating systems, this thing would actually be delivered on time. And I mean, it's now 2015, it's too early to say whether they will. They actually are making decent progress. Whereas 5 years ago, there were still people seriously arguing that there never could be a malaria vaccine. We've actually now moved to field trials of these things. So assume that that is delivered by 2020. The global rollout of polio vaccines took 20 years. So if this arrives on time in 2020, then by 2040, malaria is banished. And not just the climate-related part of malaria, but all malaria. Right? Which again changes the picture completely about what would we expect about the future and what would we expect malaria to do in the future, and how sensitive are we really to climate change. This realization leads me to the Schelling conjecture. In the early 90s, Tom Schelling, who back then was just an eminent economist, but now is a Nobel Laureate, asked two pertinent questions. The first, is the realization, if it is the case that poorer people are more vulnerable to climate change than are richer people, then it follows that any program of greenhouse gas emission reduction is in fact an income transfer, because most of the emissions come from rich countries, most of the impacts fall on poor countries. So any attempt to reduce emissions and any money spent on emission reduction would primarily benefit people in the future, A, and people in faraway countries. This is a very peculiar thing to do if you think about it, because essentially an argument to reduce emissions in the UK is essentially an argument to help the children and the grandchildren of the Bangladeshis. And if you look at our development aid, you would notice that we're actually not very keen on helping them, because we spend only a tiny fraction of our money on development aid. If you look at our migration policies or our trade policies, you could actually conclude that we distinctly dislike people from that part of the world, and we would do our best to hurt them. That's for the current generation of Bangladeshis. So why, through climate policy, all of a sudden we seem to be caring a lot about their grandchildren, even though we don't care about them themselves? I think this is a rhetorical question. It's a very odd thing that we observe. The second question that Schelling asked is if we care about the impacts of climate change. We don't care about climate change itself, but we care about the impacts of climate change. And the impacts of climate change are largely driven by poverty. Then is greenhouse gas emission reduction really the best way of reducing those impacts? Or are there other ways of doing so? And the example I gave through malaria, I think the answer to this question is pretty obvious. If you have the choice of through greenhouse gas emission reduction, pushing down the blue line a little bit at great expense, or if you can deliver a malaria vaccine at equivalent expense, then this is probably a better investment. Right? The advantage of this is that you would not just go after the climate part of malaria. And recall that the base load is 500,000 deaths, and only 75,000 of those are due to climate change. So through a vaccine, you would actually go after the sum total of malaria, not just the climate part. Whereas through greenhouse gas emission reduction, you would only go after the climate-induced part. That were the choice, then it's probably relatively easily answered. That perhaps we should be spending our money on medical technology. In the case of the story about Bangladesh and dysfunctional politics, which is the root cause of them not being able to protect their population against floods, it is not at all obvious, right? Because there is actually the problem of bad governance as a cause of underdevelopment has been recognized for a long time, but that does not necessarily mean that we know how to do this better. And it does not immediately follow that we should be spending a lot more money on official development aid, because a lot of that money has been wasted. And some would say, like Bill Easterly, that almost all of that money has been wasted. Right? I've made all these points, so we don't need to make them again. And there's exceptions to this rule as well. Because although the general tendency is that richer people tend to be less vulnerable to climate change than poorer people are, at the same time, we know that richer people put greater values on health and environment, and definitely care more about such things as species extinctions induced by climate change, would care more about the impacts on their health, or at least would be willing to pay more to avoid the impacts on their health. Richer people also tend to live longer and therefore would be more exposed to heat stress, because they develop more cardiovascular diseases, and so on and so forth. Richer people, of course, can afford air conditioning. It would make them more susceptible to climate change in that regard. So it's true in sort of a large picture kind of sense, but not necessarily true in every detail. Okay, for some reason I've been incredibly slow, and I have 2 chapters to go and 5 minutes, right? So that won't work. But I'm gonna race through this because this is actually important. And I'm going to skip the last part. Climate change. So far, I've been talking about the impacts of climate change on the economy in a static sense. But there's also dynamic implications of climate change for the economy. And broadly speaking, climate change can affect the economy, not welfare, through 4 channels. There can be direct impacts on utility, for instance, effects on biodiversity or species that would make us feel worse off, but actually not make us objectively worse off. Climate change can affect labor, people being ill, not going to work. It can affect labor productivity or output per worker. This is the size of the labor force. This is labor productivity. If your crops don't want to grow, then there's very little you can do, right? And that would reduce output per worker. And climate change could also affect depreciation. So floods and storms could wash away your buildings, and that essentially means if building is completely destroyed, that would be equivalent to 100% depreciation in a single moment, right? So all these things would occur. Climate change affects utility directly. That has no implications for the economy in any dynamic sense. But if your output is lower in period C, then obviously it's not just that you're poorer in that period, but as a result, you also have less money to invest, which implies that you will be poorer in the next period. Same is true if depreciation goes up. Essentially erodes your capital stock. Now, so that implies that what you would expect, right, is that if you have reduced output in period T, then as a result you would be poorer for the entire future that comes after. In principle, you could compensate this by increasing your savings and therefore increasing your investments. But that is not what you would want to do. For 2 reasons. One, you've got a cut in your output already. You've got a cut in your consumption because of these negative impacts. So if you then increase your savings rate, you're going to make yourself even poorer. So that is an unlikely reaction. Besides, if the output has fallen, also the returns on capital have come down. If depreciation goes up, the returns on capital go down because your piece of machinery has a shorter lifetime. So it's not rational to invest more in this sort of scenario. It's actually rational to invest less and therefore save less in this scenario. So if you put these two together, you would save less. And if then on top of that labor force shrinks, you actually have more capital per worker, so that's another reason to invest less. Output goes down, savings go down, you would expect economic growth to slow. And that is exactly what happens if you put this into standard models of economic growth. And from macro, you may recognize these names. So in this scenario, a scenario of what would be the economic implications of climate change over time. And here it would reach by the end of the 22nd century, something like 12% of GDP. If we impose this scenario on a standard Solo model or on the standard Ramsey model or on the David Romer implementation of the Paul Romer model of endogenous technological change, then we would find that the indirect impacts of climate change would be in the order of 10–15% of GDP as well. So this is the initial shock imposed, and this is the resulting slowdown in economic growth. And the total impact of climate change is then the sum of the two. So by just looking at the static impacts, as I've been doing so far, we actually get things wrong by a factor of 2. If instead we use the Monkey-Romer-Weil model, so the Solo model has fixed savings of capital accumulation, the Ramsey model endogenizes savings. The Romer model endogenizes technological change in the sense of R&D, and the Monkey-Romer-Weil model endogenizes human capital accumulation as well, so investments in schooling and training and so on and so forth. And that sees a larger response, exactly as you would expect if you know these models. And then you would underestimate these because you still have to add them. It's about 1.5 times as large. Then you should multiply the economic impacts of climate change by a factor of 3 rather than 2, if you believe that this is the correct representation of economic growth. And that is an important thing to keep in mind, that climate change would not just affect the economy in a static sense, but would also slow down economic growth. Not to the extent that you would actually reverse economic growth. So in the basic scenario, economic growth slows down because of population aging and so on and so forth. In the other scenarios, climate change would also slow down economic growth, but it would probably not reverse economic growth. That is an important thing to keep in mind as well. I'm going to stop here. The rest of the material will not be examined. And I see you guys this afternoon.